Okey, jadi pada pagi ini kita akan mulakan dengan uh, webinar sesi ketiga Green Financing ataupun pembiayaan hijau. Okay. So if any problem atau masalah, please message me or stop me ataupun kalau freeze, saya minta rakan kerja MBS untuk WhatsApp saya.
Doctor,
Yep.
sorry, can you make it as a big full screen? Because we are seeing the
Okay, 1 second. Maybe it's desktop too. Sebentar.
yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you. That's what I meant lah. Okay, Ken. So kita mulakan webinar ketiga pagi ini, Green Financing ataupun pembiayaan hijau. Dan kita akan provide overview ataupun konsep-konsep penting untuk understand what is green financing, market-based solution. So pada hari ini kita ada 3 topik. Pembiayaan hijau, green financing, what are nature-based solutions, NBS, what type of projects are there. 1 second. I will also off my video to save the bandwidth. Okay. What are nature-based solutions project atau apakah projek penyelesaian iklim semula jadi? Then what are market-based solutions for funding conservation? So apakah aktiviti pengurusan hutan berasaskan pasaran? So sebelum kita mulakan webinar minggu ini, we will ulas balik topik webinar from the last 2 weeks. Okay, so in the first webinar, we covered general concept of climate change. Kita cover konsep-konsep yang merangkumi konsep umum perubahan iklim. What is climate change? What are we doing about it? Apa yang kita buat mengenainya? Dan respon kerajaan sedunia. And one of the main focus of our webinar is perubahan iklim dan hutan. In second week, in minggu kedua, kita membincangkan perkhidmatan ekosistem, kaitan antara perubahan iklim dan biodiversity, contoh-contoh di Malaysia, what type of forests we have, biodiversity. I think we also focused on Terengganu, and the third topic was kaedah menguruskan biodiversity dengan lebih baik. So jadi webinar 1 and 2 memang untuk beri foundation sikit lah from the global level, perubahan iklim di Malaysia, what are we doing, what is our response, what is our forest, how is it important for climate change. But in my history or my background in conservation, there's always one important question. Who's going to pay for all this work? Siapa yang akan bayar? When we ask that question, everyone always keep quiet. So today, we will talk about green financing. What is it? What type of projects? An example of market-based solutions or dana jangka panjang dari pihak swasta. So background a bit. So one of the main konsep utama dalam penyesuaian dan mitigasi perubahan iklim is baseline scenario or business as usual scenario. Jadi inilah scenario di mana tidak ada tindakan untuk mengurangkan pelepasan GHG ataupun greenhouse gas. Dan yang ini akan menyebabkan kenaikan suhu global. It's an important concept. Yeah, I want everyone to remember this. This is the most important concept when we talk about carbon offset and nature-based solution. And there's also a scenario alternative, di mana tindakan untuk memastikan suhu global tidak melebihi tahap yang berbahaya. Jadi this tahap is the 2-degree tahap. If we exceed it, there'll be a lot of repercussion for us all over the world, not just in Malaysia. Sea level rise, intense storm, as my colleague Norizan covered in the first week. And really our target is to memastikan perubahan suhu global tidak melebihi 2 darjah Celsius by 2050, by the year 2050. So there's no more time anymore. We cannot wait 10 more years, 20 more years. I think we have to take action now lah. And next, I will share our video keempat dalam siri video perubahan iklim yang kita yang pihak dari Sunway dengan Rumen telah sediakan mengenai perubahan iklim dalam bahasa Terengganu. I will admit my bahasa Terengganu is not that good. I understand a bit only. So maybe we can ask Ruben and Sunway to do some videos in bahasa Sarawak lah, that one I'm more comfortable with lah. So I'll share the video after this.
Pok mak seorang nelayan dari Terengganu. Rugi besar dia lah ni sebab tak boleh tangkap ikan banyak super dulu. Awak tahu dah buat apa?
Amba rasa sebab le ni dia tua dah. Kudrat dah macam 10 tahun dulu. Amba teka-teka. Ni sebab pemanasan global juga ke?
Saya tak pasti umur dia. Tapi ya, hujang hot dok tentu masa sebab pemanasan global menyebabkan jadinya pemanasan laut dengan kadar penyejatan air laut yang tinggi. Hujan le ni dok kira musim. Sebab tu juga boleh jejahkan punca rezeki nelayan contoh macam Pok Mat. Ni boleh sebab jadi payah Pok Mat nak racang waktu dia nak turun ke laut. Pok Mat terpaksa cari kerja lain untuk sara keluarga dia. Kalau hari hok boleh turun ke laut pun, dok banyak ikan hok boleh dok macam dulu. Jebah boleh ikan. Hari tu hujan lebat. Habis punah rumah Pok Mat dan keluarga dia sebab hakisan pantai. Rugi pula RM5,000.
Nyaknya ke. Saya nak tolong pun muka saya sendiri bukan orang senang. Saya pun kena tanggung keluarga saya.
Tak apa, saya faham. Saya dok harap awak bantu semua orang. Tapi inilah salah satu sebab cerita malam mangsa akibat perubahan iklim ni. Kesan dia bukan saja jejakan kehidupan kita dari segi ekonomi, tapi juga aspek lain. Maksud saya, kita ni tengah hadapi cabaran hak besar dan juga boleh selesai sekarang. Cuba awak bayangkan, kerana kalau satu hari kat gigi, awak tak boleh kerja. Tak boleh nak sara keluarga awak. Tahu tak perubahan iklim ni boleh jejakan kesihatan awak juga. Awak ada masa lagi tak?
So ini video keempat, siri video perubahan iklim yang disediakan oleh Sunway University dengan Prof Ruben dengan student-studentnya. Jadi memang the impact of climate change on both iklim and also ecosystem services are very important and will have long-term implication. So that's why we have to respond, not just as individual, tapi kerajaan sedunia, Malaysia, state governments, private sector all have a important role to play. Jadi what is Malaysia's response? Apakah respond kerajaan Malaysia? Jadi memang sebagai signatory in the Paris Agreement, Malaysia telah menetapkan sasaran mitigasi dan penyesuaian perubahan iklim untuk mengurangkan greenhouse gas emissions by 45% berbandingkan tahun 2005. Jadi what this means is compared to the year 2005, we need to reduce the amount of GHG emitted by 45%. Jadi from this chart kita boleh tengok bahawa penyumbang terbesar kepada gas GHG atau gas kacau hijau, we use GHG adalah from the energy sector. So and one of the important things seperti yang dibentangkan oleh Puan Noriza week 1 is memang di Malaysia we have forest cover which helps capture the carbon as well. We go to the next slide. Yang ini adalah GHG inventory lah yang dikeluarkan oleh Malaysia's Biennial Update Report. Jadi inilah report yang dikeluarkan oleh kerajaan Malaysia sebagai signatory on the Paris Agreement untuk to be more transparent about GHG emissions from negara Malaysia. So as we can see, in 2004-2005, memang if we take all the emission, kira pengeluaran gas and also penyerapan gas oleh hutan-hutan ataupun land use in Malaysia, Malaysia was net zero ataupun sifar what the Malay word for it, but it's net zero in the year 2005. So maybe there's another term we can try to find, net zero in bahasa. So what we can see is one of the main strategy, or we can say that strategi negara ialah untuk mengurangkan pelepasan gas GHG daripada sektor tenaga and at the same time menambah daya kemampuan sektor guna tanah dan perhutanan untuk menjadi sinki karbon yang lebih berkesan. And this is very interesting because our Prime Minister yesterday telah mengumumkan target Malaysia untuk mencapai net zero ataupun sifar karbon target net zero by 2050. So I have a recording from this week's RMK announcement.
Pada hari ini saya memberikan komitmen bahawa Malaysia akan menjadi negara neutral karbon seawal-awalnya pada tahun 2050. Bagi menyokong usaha ini, instrumen ekonomi seperti carbon pricing dan cukai karbon akan diperkenalkan. Perincian langkah-langkah lain bagi pengurangan karbon akan diumumkan setelah kajian strategi pembangunan jangka panjang rendah karbon dimuktamadkan pada akhir tahun 2022.
Yep. So this is a, I think, good target pengumuman from our Prime Minister untuk sasaran carbon net zero ataupun sifar bersih menjelang tahun 2050. And how we will achieve this, as Norizan has covered, yang dimakan oleh Puan Norizan, in terms of carbon storage, intact forests in Southeast Asia, memang on a per hectare basis, can capture a lot of carbon compared to other forests on the planet. Sorry, give me 1 second, my kucing is gila. Sorry. Sorry. So one of our benefits in Malaysia is definitely we have old forests. They can capture carbon very well. And beyond just trees, forests for trees, biodiversity, as Ruben covered last week, also provides important ecosystem services. So we know that biodiversity juga menyediakan perkhidmatan ekosistem yang penting seperti climate change mitigation, food provision, health, cultural value. And if we were to calculate what is the value of these services, in 2011 it's about 125 trillion USD. The value of ecosystem just from termites alone is 200 billion per year. They are very important for breaking down wood, decomposing wood in the forest. But we also see active threats to biodiversity. So for example, global illegal wildlife trade is worth also 23 billion. Again, the important question today is, persoalan penting ialah siapa yang harus membayar untuk perlindungan biodiversity. So the next video that related to this is the 5th video. So video kelima dalam siri video perubahan iklim ecosystem services yang disediakan oleh pihak-pihak oleh Ruben dengan studentnya di Sunway University.
Sakit paru-paru dengan jantung, denggi dan kejahatan haba, semua ni ada sepersamaan. Menurut kajian, sebab perubahan iklim ni lah masalah kesihatan macam penyakit denggi, paru-paru dengan jantung jadi banyak. Menurut Menteri Kesihatan Malaysia, golongan hak paling berisiko sebab perubahan iklim ni adalah penduduk luar bandar.
Awak yakin ke? Saya tak percaya.
Biar saya terang gini kau. Banjir ialah bencana alam semula jadi hak paling serius di negara kita ni. Salah satu kesan perubahan iklim ialah frekuensi kejadian banjir kohor banyak dan kohor ekstrim. Banjir bukan hanya menyebabkan kerugian besar, tapi juga boleh menyejahkan bekalan air bersih dan jaminan makanan selamat. Denggi dan leptospirosis pun boleh terjadi juga. Contohnya, masa banjir besar pada 2017, ada banyak kes leptospirosis berlaku selepas banjir.
Leptospirosis tu bukan penyakit kecil tikus ke? Bahaya tu.
Ya, memang takut bong. Awak tahu tak, bekalan makanan kita pun ada risiko. Awak ada masalah lagi tak?
So as we can see, impact climate change on weather patterns, increased flooding can also lead to increased health risks as well. So it's not just a global concept far away in the Antarctic, but also here back home in Malaysia, the impact is felt mainly by communities living outside the urban area who are in flood risk zones. Again, just to zoom in on why we need to mitigate and adapt to climate change for the next as soon as we can. Okay. So, kita dah mulai webinar di tingkat global dari segi perubahan iklim dan fokus pada hutan sebagai strategi mitigasi perubahan iklim. Jadi pada minggu ini kita akan membincangkan pembiayaan hijau dan memperkenalkan konsep-konsep penting focus on memang around nature-based solution, NBS. Kita akan gunakan NBS as a short form dan penyertaan sektor swasta dalam membiayai pemeliharaan perlindungan hutan. So the first question is, what is green financing? Okay. Untuk memahami apa itu pembiayaan hijau, kita perlu mengembangkan pemahaman yang lebih baik mengenai jurang pembiayaan pembiayaan untuk kawasan terlindung sekarang di Malaysia. So we will present or discuss what are the gaps in funding protected areas or conservation in Malaysia. This will help us develop an understanding of what is green financing. So I will not define it in the beginning. Kita buat reverse sikit. I will talk about the problem, and then at the end we will define what is green financing. So, seperti yang telah presented already by Ruben and Dylan last week, what are protected areas in Malaysia? So, what is the status? Status kawasan perlindungan di Malaysia sekarang. So, Malaysia we have set targets for establishing protected area yang ini telah is captured in our national policy on biological diversity, and memang target 6 is by 2025 at least 20% terrestrial areas and inland waters and 10% of coastal and marine areas conserved through kawasan terlindung protected areas, or is just another category, effective area-based conservation measures or ECM. But the definition and the criteria for these are still being discussed and decided on at the national level. But just to provide an overview, there are maybe how to differentiate the both between kawasan terlindung dengan OECM. Jadi objektif utama untuk PA kawasan terlindung adalah konservasi biodiversity. Tapi untuk OECM mungkin ada objektif yang lain. Tapi masih ada manfaat kepada biodiversity. So for example untuk OECM mungkin kawasan ladang, all palm plantation dengan kawasan HCV, untuk to make sure the pengurusan tanah lestari dan mampan, not just deforestation, but we need to see kawasan-kawasan yang penting untuk biodiversity ataupun ecosystem services dalam kawasan ladang yang perlu dilindungkan ataupun diurus supaya ecosystem services masih is protected in this production area. Jadi agak different compared to protected area, whereby the focus is just conservation, not production. So for example, contoh kategori untuk kawasan terlindung, hutan perlindungan in HSK or in forest reserve, hutan simpan, taman negara, taman negeri, taman laut, reserve penyu dan tuntong, or wildlife sanctuaries. These are examples of totally protected area. And compared to OECM, as I said, OECM tu memang combination lah kawasan produksi di ladang ataupun kawasan yang diurus untuk pengeluaran bala, dan ada kawasan yang set aside di dalam kawasan production ini untuk manfaat biodiversity dan ecosystem services. Jadi if our target is 20%, where are we now in Malaysia? Jadi based on the last report, it's about 13.2%. And marine is about 3.27%. Jadi this is a map of forest reserves and totally protected area. So yang I shared early on, 13% is totally protected area, dan kebanyakan hutan di Malaysia diuruskan sebagai forest reserves or as state land forests. So it's managed for various reasons. Our forest in Malaysia untuk production, pengeluaran bala or timber, for wildlife sanctuary, kawasan perlindungan hidupan liar, water catchment, kawasan tadahan air, in some cases for research as well, pendidikan. So we can see this was covered by Norizan, but Sabah, Sarawak and Peninsula have 3 different land codes with different categories for gazetting forests, for forest management, and even at the state level, it's adopted differently by different states in Peninsular Malaysia. So what we can say is 13% is protected across Malaysia, and most of the forest is already managed for various reasons. So when we zoom in into Terengganu, so in the year 2021, approximately 20.9% of Terengganu is managed as totally protected area or protected area. And if we compare to the other states, it's number 3 after Sabah and Pahang, which is quite high. And really based on these definitions, what type of forest is wildlife sanctuary, kawasan reserve, taman laut, HSK, reserve kehidupan luar, taman negeri and taman negara, all make up this 20.9%. But I think in many cases, atau di dalam banyak kes, sumber yang disediakan tidak mencukupi untuk memastikan pengurusan kawasan perlindungan memenuhi maklumat pemeliharaan. So I think in a lot of cases, when we set aside totally protected area, there may not be enough resources to manage it for conservation. This is what we call paper parks. Cuma on kertas only protected, terlindung, tapi how do we manage it for conservation? For example, anti-poaching work, restoration work, management work. All this cost money. Who should pay for it? And a lot of times, PA in Malaysia is mainly funded by public funds. Kawasan terlindung di Malaysia terutamanya dibayar dengan dana awam, lebih khususnya kerajaan negeri. So, in some cases, cost ini is also supplemented by short-term grant, dalam mungkin CSR program dengan big companies in Malaysia or ecotourism in some cases. But is it enough to manage these areas for conservation? I think in general, the answer is no. They help supplement, but they cannot cover the cost. And also, a lot of these funds are not long-term. So, we ask ourselves again the same question, who should pay for protecting forests? So, siapa lagi yang harus membayar untuk melindungi hutan? So, to explore this, this is a famous presentation by Dr. Bala from ERE Consulting. Dia telah meringkaskan sebab-sebab mengapa kawasan perlindungan atau pemeliharaan kekurangan dana di Malaysia. Why is it not enough funding for protected areas and also conservation activities in Malaysia? So one of the main reasons is as a federation and the way our constitution was drafted many years ago when Malaysia was formed is tanah air dan hutan berada di bawah bidang kuasa pemerintah negeri. So this means at the same time kos untuk mengurus hutan dan kawasan lindung ditanggung terutamanya oleh kerajaan negeri. So we can look at it as two types of economy. Okay, we have the modern economy, which the federal government derives a lot of this revenue from income tax, import duties, GST, SST, licenses, petroleum, investments. When we compare to kerajaan negeri, it's reliant on the old economy. Natural resource use, timber royalty, land premiums, minerals, water, palm oil, investments on assets and properties, licenses, and also federal government contribution. So we can see that the two different levels of government have different types of revenue stream. So the bulk of the state government revenue is directly linked to land use and natural resource. So if we were to set aside PA or protect more forests, this is a loss of revenue. And at the same time, additional costs needs to be made available to manage these areas. So kerajaan memang bergantung pada sumber asli untuk menjanakan dana or to mendapatkan hasil. This is important, this is hasil pendapatan is important, penting untuk mengurus negeri dan memastikan pembangunan. Tapi mengetepikan PA adalah represent kehilangan pendapatan yang besar dan ditambahkan dengan kos pengurusan tambahan. So states need to rely on logging pembelakan, you can see reclamation projects, establishing plantations, mendirikan ladang, and also activity pelombongan. So these activities menjana pendapatan dan merangsangkan ekonomi tempatan, tetapi dengan kos kepada alam persekitaran. There is a cost to the environment in order to secure revenue for development and for the well-being of states. Here we can see peta PA and forest reserve in Peninsular Malaysia, dan the red areas adalah forest loss since the year 2000 until the year 2020. although a lot of it is outside of kawasan HSK and PA, we do see some degradation within forest reserves. So again, there's a kekurangan insentif daripada pengurusan kawasan lindung. This leads to keringan dan kemerosotan hutan. And we can see from this map in front here that even though it's memang keringan hutan is happening outside of forest reserve, we can see that some forest reserves are affected as well. So, who should pay for forest protection, or how can we redistribute the wealth to support forest protection and the climate agenda? So, if we can see in this chart, revenue from the modern economy is a lot more than the old economy. Kalau kita bandingkan ekonomi lama dan ekonomi baru, memang federal government in 2016 made revenue of 212 billion. How much did the rest of the states make? In total, 20 billion, or about 9% of what the federal government made. So we can ask ourselves a few questions. A lot of our target for climate change and forest protection are developed at the national level. How do we connect policy at the state level with this national agenda? Okay, so just to show in this chart the very big difference in revenue and between federal government and state government. Yang kedua, bolehkah kita menyalurkan pembiayaan sektor swasta ke dalam pelindungan hutan? Okay, can we create market access and demand for forest protection? And why should we? Why should companies pay for forest protection? Again, like we said, climate change mitigation, ecosystem services. And if we compare revenue in 2016, we can see that all the companies also make a lot more money than a lot of states in Malaysia. So based on this chart, we can see TNB and Maybank make more than Sarawak. If we look for Terengganu in the middle there, 7-Eleven, Gamuda, Maidin, Maybank, and TNB makes a lot more revenue than the state government of Terengganu. So if everyone is benefiting from the modern economy, from other forms of economy, and state governments need to rely on natural resources, but at the same time protect forests, it's a mismatch of incentive, I think. We need to think about ways on how to enable more funding, not just from federal government, but from private sector for forest protection. So, financing forest and biodiversity conservation in Malaysia, realigning incentives and enhancing partnerships. So, in Dr. Bala's presentation, he summarized 3 main strategies for in Malaysia to increase forest protection and conservation. Right? Jadi yang pertama, yang paling direct is increase resource for management, meningkatkan dana kewangan untuk pengurusan projek konservasi ataupun pelindungan hutan. So, provide more money, people, tools, and resource to support forest and biodiversity managers, partnership, kerjasama dengan community, private sector, dan NGO, and also promote and facilitate private sector participation. We need to encourage private sector to channel funds into forest protection. Yang kedua, offset opportunity cost to state government. As I shared early on, memang a lot of the revenue comes from natural resource. So we should share the burden of conserving our nation's heritage. How do we do this? Maybe we can do performance-based incentives. So there's a few different framework or solutions we can use to offset opportunity costs. Ganti rugi, project offset atau project mengimbangi, incentive or pembayaran berdasarkan prestasi, pemindahan fiskal, duit ecology. DFT, I think this has been launched by the federal government recently as well. And the third one, yang paling susah, is restructure the federal state fiscal system. Can we reimagine or restructure how states can derive revenue? Maybe we can create more avenue for states to generate income from the modern economy, not just reliant on natural resource. This will reduce the pressure on deforestation, natural resource extraction. So when we ask ourselves, apakah itu pembiayaan hijau? What is green financing? This is green financing. It's very simple. We don't need to go into complicated concept or technical work. Memang green financing is pembiayaan hijau adalah aktiviti untuk meningkatkan aliran kewangan dari sektor awam, swasta dan NGO untuk aktiviti yang melindung, mengurus secara berlanjutan dan memulakan ekosistem semula jadi yang telah diubah suai. So both for green financing and nature-based solutions are very aligned. We are looking at increasing the flows of funding from various sectors for sustainable development ataupun pembangunan lestari atau mampan, tapi untuk topik hari ini untuk nature-based solution untuk MBS. Okay. So memang these are concepts which are aligned or parallel, selari untuk bertujuan untuk menyalurkan dana kepada aktiviti-aktiviti yang melindungi alam sekitar. So when we come back to, can we protect areas of forests and make it self-sustainable? So maybe when we compare PA, when resources are not made available, nature-based solution projects have many, are able to solve some of these problems, right? You can create more resources to provide more financing so that you can protect forests and also create benefits to communities. Not just protect forests for climate change, create jobs for local communities, protect wildlife and biodiversity. And a lot of nature-based solutions project is based on performance-based payments. Okay, so next I will go into these key concepts. Okay, nature-based solution. So what are nature-based solutions projects? Okay, I think this has been covered in week 1 and week 2. Again, green financing, nature-based solution project, these are just new words. The concept is very simple. Let's increase financial flow into projects that protect the environment, not just for climate, but also for communities and biodiversity. Jadi, why is nature-based solutions important for climate change? Seperti yang kita dah cover dalam webinar pertama, ada 2 strategi utama untuk mengurangkan perubahan iklim. One is engineering solutions ataupun penyelesaian kejuruteraan. Contohnya renewable energy, solar, geothermal, wave, wind power, green technology, ataupun teknologi hijau, electric vehicles, you know, can priors, I think Malaysia we're starting also to introduce EV as one of our main strategy for climate change mitigation. Any technology yang mengurangkan pergantungan kita kepada bahan bakar fosil. So any technology that reduce our reliance on fossil fuel energy. There are new technology like carbon capture units, CCU. I read about some example. I think Norway was one of the first countries to introduce CCU technology in the oil rig so that CO2 is not released from factories. In Saudi as well is using CCU technology. And these are one of the main ways is really to reduce our reliance on fossil fuel. But new technology takes time, needs to be developed and require very, very high investments. People are always scared to try new technology. The other solution is nature-based solution, NBS, nature-based climate solution, which also can help us mitigate climate change. So, you know, this is mainly through avoided GHG emissions. So, and also capturing carbon. And there are 3 main categories. It's forestry, perhutanan, agriculture, sektor pertanian, dan wetland management ataupun pengurusan tanah lembap. And in terms of nature-based solution, okay, 33.8% potensi mitigasi penyelesaian iklim or mitigasi NBS globally berpunca dari kawasan tropika, which includes Malaysia. Okay, so forest landscape restoration is a planned process that aims to regain ecological integrity and enhance human well-being in deforested or degraded areas. So FLR, forest landscape restoration, adalah pemulihan landscape adalah proses terancang yang bertujuan untuk mendapatkan kembali integriti ekologi untuk ecosystem services that are important for us in many ways, as Ruben has covered, dan meningkatkan kesejahteraan manusia dalam landscape hutan yang terosot. So in this diagram, we can see how do we implement pemulihan landscape. We can see we can do wide-scale restoration, you know, in the forested areas. We can protect degraded primary forests, manage secondary forests, and then in production area, we can do mosaic restoration, all right, to improve connectivity, to improve kawasan tahan air, more climate-friendly agriculture practice. So we can look at a landscape and plan so that at the landscape level, we are managing our production and protection area, not just for climate change, for protection, but also for economic reasons as well. So again, the main NBS projects that can capture a lot of carbon is definitely forests, followed by improved agricultural practices, and finally wetlands management. But in Malaysia, I think for today's focus as well, we will just speak more about the forestry sector. And these are, in front of you, you can see a list of different types of NBS projects for climate mitigation. For example, penanaman semula hutan, mengelakkan perubahan guna tanah, or avoided deforestation, reforestation project, forest management, hutan secara lestari asli. There's also management of peatlands, kawasan gambut, which has stores a lot of carbon, and also management of kawasan pesisir pantai. So I think these are we can call it low-bearing fruits. Malaysia and the tropics is rich in forests and natural ecosystems, which already can capture carbon. If we protect it, this will also contribute to our climate agenda. Again, compared to technology, which takes time to develop, needs to be adopted, these are solutions which are there already. We just need to be creative about it in securing funding to protect and manage these areas. Okay, now we talk about NBS projects and how benefits are measured. And this is important because if we can measure the benefit, we can put a value to it, and we can put the value to it, we can raise funding for it. So again, the next slide is a very important concept that I want everybody to capture. So benefit from nature-based solution. Okay, apakah manfaat daripada NBS project? So an important thing is the baseline. So baseline, I think in BM is garis dasar. Okay, garis dasar keadaan dari segi pelepasan GHG, community, dan biodiversity. Okay, so what is the baseline? What is the current condition in terms of how much GHG is being released? What, are there communities who rely on the forest or not? Who are the stakeholders? What is the biodiversity there? Are there any threats? Okay, and then we need to think about the scenario. Yeah. So if this is the baseline, again, this concept is business as usual. So for example, if it's logging or deforestation, then over 30 years, we need to measure the changes over 30 years. And then we have the project scenario. Jadi, we were to do avoided logging. So for example lah, kalau we have kawasan hutan yang telah earmark ataupun set aside for conversion or logging, let's say we change the activity pengurusan, no more logging. I want to protect this area. Why? It's an important area. It's kawasan tadahan air. There are wildlife there. So we will change the current management plan from logging or deforestation to avoided logging. So over, the project period, maybe 30 years, 50 years, 60 years, 100 years, forever, we need to measure net impact of GHG emission, community benefit, and biodiversity benefit. The difference between these two scenarios is the outcome or impact from the nature-based solution. Okay, this is a very important concept. Again, if we think back to climate change, this is the concept that is always being used: business as usual scenario and project scenario. Okay, so in terms of NBS and perubahan iklim ataupun GHG, how do we measure GHG from land use? Okay, just to recap, forests or standing forests can capture CO2, and then when we clear forests or when we degrade it and we don't manage it properly, they can release CO2. If we grow new forests, it also captures CO2, and the CO2 is captured as biomass ataupun biogeosim in the vegetation, in the soil, in the organic matter. And this biogeosim or biomass is one of the main ways we measure carbon or GHG from forestry. So how do we measure biomass or carbon stock in Malaysia? So Malaysia and Peninsula, we have the National Forest Inventory, which is conducted every 10 years to monitor forest stock for commercial timber, but also, biomass, forest cover, and we have about 18 forest strata or klasifikasi forest based on the NFI.
Doktor,
Yeah.
boleh saya tanya soalan sikit?
Boleh, boleh, boleh.
Go back to the previous slide. Okay. Kalau kita tengok ni standing forest and young and regrowing forest, which one capture most of the carbon dioxide lah?
Okay, very good question. Very, very good question. Okay, so maybe it's not capture, but it's more on the flow of carbon. Because standing forests are old growth forests. If we protect it and we don't deforest it, we don't release the carbon that is already captured. Jadi in standing forest, the carbon is already captured. You know, it's very tall trees, very complex structure, not just one layer, 4 layers. You know, it's also rich in biodiversity, which can also help capture carbon. Jadi the carbon is protected in old growth forests. In young regrowing forests, so for example, if we do project penanaman semula, the carbon is captured. So it's two different things. It's not A or B. Memang one is you protect the carbon sink. Number two is you capture more carbon. But when we talk about young regrowing forest ataupun project restorasi penanaman semula, in terms of cost, it's cheaper to protect a forest than it is to regrow a forest. That I will expand later on. And the other thing, when we talk about project penanaman semula, there's also a risiko of failure. It's not easy to regrow forests. You know, you can grow for 5 years, 7 years, depends on what type of ecosystem. If there's a wildfire, then you lose all your investment in your restoration project.
So Doctor, means that kita perlu balak dulu lah ni.
Salah konsep tu, you know. You know what? You have to protect the forest.
Sebab you said just now, young regrowing forest ni memang akan capture the carbon dioxide lagi banyak lah kan? Suppose kan?
Tapi when you balak, you keluarkan CO2. Jadi, you samkan.
Okay, teruskan. Cuma Doktor satu lagi, kita boleh buka pada soalan ya? Boleh
Boleh. Maybe
boleh. Kita minta hadirin yang ada soalan boleh raise hand ya. Okay, terima kasih. Teruskan Doktor.
Anytime, if you have any question, or if you want me to expand on some section, just raise your hand, let me know. Moderator can also stop me sometimes because I cannot see the chat. So I appreciate just stop me anytime, no problem. Okay. Okay, so we talk about NFI, how Malaysia is measuring carbon stock or forest inventory, forest cover. But we can also use remote sensing. Okay, remote sensing is using data satellite berasaskan imagery or LiDAR to melihat atau memantau perubahan biogeosim dan membuat unjuran projek senario dan yang berbeza. So in front of you, you can see a map that we, Rimba and MBS, have developed untuk biomass modeling di Terengganu. Okay, this can be a tool in the future for land use planners to estimate above ground biomass or biogeosim from forests in Terengganu, and also look at baseline and project emission scenario. So the map or the tool or model that we developed is a 30-meter resolution. So you can see on the left is the border between Taman Negara National Park border and plantation and on log forest. So if it's dark green, high biomass by using a tinggi, which means healthy forest, and if it's red, it's low biomass. So areas that have been converted for plantation or development, and light green are areas that may have been degraded from logging. Okay, and at 30-meter resolution, you know, we can see in the map on the right where the trails are, sometimes or degradation associated from selective logging, from access roads, for example. Just disclaimer, this biomass model is still WIP, still being developed to improve accuracy. So these are just some early data that we want to share with the audience today. So if we want to use biomass or biogeosim untuk mengukur dan memantau senario penguraan pelepasan gas GHG, so the map on the left, you can see a biomass map. Okay, so it's estimated for the year 2020. So altogether, it's about 218 million tons of above ground biomass. it's still WIP. But on the left is again just for hypothetical scenario, okay? So for example, if for some reason over the last 82 years, these green areas was never managed for protection, it would be 272, so an increase in biomass. Again, this is not now into the future, it's just looking back in the past because we are still working on the model. But I think the important message I want to share is there are many ways which we can measure biomass that can help us with planning. So right now with the model that we are building, we do hope to generate and share a biomass map with the state government soon this year to explore potential areas and also explore potential for carbon offsets in Terengganu. So the model right now can predict biomass at 30-meter resolution, and up to date we have used about 3 million data points, 40 predictors, which includes topography, land cover, surface water, disturbance, and land management type. I think so far we have used about 14 terabyte of data to develop this model. And in one of the upcoming sessions, we do hope to share more about it. But again, this disclaimer is still WIP lah. And why I wanted to bring this up is, I think we can use biomass or GHG modeling in land use planning. So we know that we have a lot of good master plan, Rancangan Fizikal Negara, Terengganu has development plans, we have ecological plans for protecting linkage, CFS. But I wonder how are we taking into account forest inventory, biomass inventory, and GHG inventory in land use planning? Okay, so if we incorporate GHG emission scenario into land use planning, we can make forecast or unjuran masa depan on the climate impact, and while planning, we can plan whether or not we want to avoid those release of GHG from development, right? So if we have a baseline and a alternative scenario, we can use this data to set aside important areas for protection, for restoration, and develop these areas into a nature-based solution project. So the key point is we have the tool and technical capacity to incorporate GHG mapping into land use planning. And through this, with this as an additional tool, we can incorporate it into more efficient setting aside of areas for protection for the reasons for climate change. I talk about climate change, GHG, now I talk about cost lah. Okay, at the end of the day, it costs a lot to either protect an area for conservation or to restore an area. So in front of you, you have a summary of, just a broad summary of the different types of restoration activities that can take place. We talk about degradation, stage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So stage 1, if you can imagine, is maybe secondary forests, recently logged or partially degraded from various activities. It can be managed for protection. You just need to set it aside, make sure you prevent fire, make sure you prevent livestock grazing, and the cost is probably about 5,000 ringgit per hectare over 30 years. Again, this cost is just indicative. Of course, it will be more specific if you know the area and what are the threats. Stage 2 and 3 is again maybe secondary forest or heavily logged over area where you need to plant trees. There are various methods, but again there are a lot of costs associated with tree planting and penanaman semula. So I mean 3 and 4. Okay, you need to plant the trees, you need to set up the nursery, you need to manage and maintain over 7 years, 10 years to make sure the trees can take care of themselves. So the cost goes up from 5,000, 10,000 to 30,000 and 60,000 per hectare over the course of the restoration period. And number 5 is the most extreme one. So this is like for mining areas where you need to re-establish the soil, plant the trees, establish the nursery, manage intensively. So we come back to our question. It really does cost a lot. So even though you want to plant back, you want to do restoration, the cost is too much. It's a big barrier for us to achieve that GHG capture. If it costs too much and we can't afford it, we cannot capture the carbon from restoration. So, stage 1, stage 2, manage protected areas, manage areas that are not heavily degraded. It's a lot more affordable. So,
Dr. Ada soalan daripada Encik Syarif daripada Majlis Pengurusan Taman Negeri.
okay.
Hello, hi, Doctor. Sorry. Just wondering how the estimated cost on this table, how the estimated cost being estimated?
Okay, so this is from my own compilation over the last 7 years. We look at the cost for establishing nursery, manpower to manage, the size of the area, management regime, for example, how often do you want to run maintenance? How many years before you let it regenerate by itself? If there's any audience here who would like to know more about how these costs are derived, you can contact me. I can share more resources on how these numbers were developed.
All right, thank you, Doctor.
No problem. Yeah. It's so we have a tool that we can use to help land use managers to see how much it costs to restore an area. So again, if you know what is the size of the area and the type of degradation, we can build a 30-year, 50-year budget to estimate how much it will cost.
So basically, this estimated cost per hectare is for a year or for a project?
This one, for these numbers, are estimated at 30 years. So I assume 30 years before we can leave it alone. Here, the forest can jaga sendiri. But we can also adjust the period, the project period.
So I mean, let's say if I going for the stage 3, the tree planting using fast growing pioneers to accelerate national regeneration is around 30,000 per hectare.
Yeah.
So
Again,
it's for
yeah. So I think this numbers is 30,000 per hectare. I estimated for 10,000 hectare over 30 years. These numbers will change based on the scale. So
10,000 hectare for 30 years.
Something like that, yeah.
Okay, okay, all right. Thank you, Doctor.
No problem. Also, just preview. I think next week we will talk more about the project budget and economics, so we can unpack a bit more the assumption behind these numbers, not just for protection but also restoration. But today I just want to show it's expensive cheaper to protect than it is to restore. And if you look, and if you look at the restoration staircase again, I come back to my main point, which is this okay. Really, if you want to reclaim the mine, the time and cost is very, very high. Again, and there's a lot of risk. Maybe your project will fail compared to natural regeneration. So if it's not so degraded, or if it's nearby a big forest, it can regenerate by itself. All we need to do is manage it for protection, so it can capture GHG. You can still provide the ecosystem services. It's just logical. I don't need to explain in too much detail, kan? So in the end of the day, the main thing is, can we use smart climate planning to secure green financing? So we can think ahead. Can we secure green financing for these types of projects? So I think if we incorporate reduced GHG emissions planning into land use planning, we can develop NVS projects that contribute to the climate agenda while allowing us to increase the flow of funding into conservation and protected area. Okay, so the two main solutions that I will focus on right now in terms of green financing or Pemain Hijau is increased resource for management and offset opportunity. This is the next part of my presentation. What are the market-based solutions? Okay, penyelesaian berasaskan pasaran. Okay. Bertingkatkan aliran kewangan dari sektor swasta kepada pemeliharaan. But before we start, I wonder if there's any questions from anyone before we jump into the last section of our presentation today. Okay, actually I want to drink water, so give me 10 seconds.
Ada soalan ke pada semua? Tak apa.
Okay, no problem. No soalan, no problem. Maybe
boleh teruskan.
Everyone understand very well, can answer the quiz well, and win all the prize. Okay.
Should be.
Okay, so now we talk about market-based solution. What are the example kan? Okay, so there's carbon offset project,
Yep.
Project carbon offset. There's different type of market, compliance ataupun pematuhan based on regulation, non-compliance, which is voluntary market ataupun pasaran sukarela. And we also talk about project eligibility, how to qualify projects to become carbon offset project. I will also talk about conservation liability or recovery plan project. So this is also a very fancy word, but to simplify it is projects to offset deforestation that is linked to the commodity sector. So Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, RSPO, and companies who have made no deforestation, no peat, or no exploitation commitments, NDPE. These are essentially commodities that are linked to the these are companies that are linked to the oil palm commodity supply chain who have committed to reduce deforestation. And if they are caught deforesting or if they have bad practices within the supply chain, they need to set aside funding to protect forests and to conserve forests. And the last one, which I will talk briefly, is the Malaysian REDD Plus Finance Framework. Talk about the national guidelines, talk about forest conservation certificate and forest carbon offset. So these are the three main market-based solutions that I will talk about in the last section of our webinar today. Jadi, carbon offset project, how does it work? Okay. Sometimes people say this is a complicated concept. I think at first it is, but once you think about it, it makes sense. Okay, so just be patient with me as I try to explain how does carbon offsetting work. So number one, okay, company ada jejak carbon ataupun carbon footprint. Number two, they can invest or they can melabur dalam projek penguraan pelepasan GHG, so they can invest in projects that reduce emissions of GHG. So number three, contohnya renewable energy, waste management, or reforestation project, forest protection project. And this is based on the concept I shared early on. You have a baseline and you have a project scenario, and the differences, the outcomes of between baseline and project scenario is the climate benefit. Okay, so project ini akan menjana carbon credit, okay, yang boleh dijual atau we can retire it. Okay, so what do you mean by retire? So if I purchase the carbon credit, I can retire it to offset my carbon footprint. Okay, so the carbon credit boleh mengimbangi pelepasan GHG from my operation, so that me as a company boleh mencapai net zero ataupun pelepasan karbon sifar bersih. Alright, so who has this type of commitments? I shared early on, Malaysia has a target to become net zero by 2050. But recently in Malaysia, we know that Petronas, TNB, and Shell have also made commitment carbon sifar bersih. So companies want to offset their footprint, so they can do it through purchasing carbon credits as well. Of course, in terms of strategy, adaptation, and mitigation for net zero, companies should reduce their footprint. Number one, always mitigate before you offset. Jadi, invest in new technology, green technology, reduce your carbon footprint. And if you cannot reduce anymore, there's no new technology, and you still have a carbon footprint, okay, now you can buy carbon offset credits to offset the remaining footprint. So that's how it works in general. You buy the credit and then you retire, and then you reduce your footprint. So in terms of what type of market exists, so mekanisme pasaran karbon antarabangsa. So there's two main one, pasaran compliance and pasaran sukarela. So compliance market and voluntary market. So we won't go into great detail because Norizan already covered it. So for compliance market, it means there are regulations. Okay, so it's regulated. Companies' footprint, carbon footprint are being measured. There are things like carbon tax. So if you have a very big footprint, you have to pay a carbon tax. So that's why they want to is to promote companies to reduce their footprint and also to potentially offset. Tetapi compliance market still in development. There's still negotiation going on at the global level. It's still in a process pembangunan, WIP. And the other market is the voluntary carbon market. So it's the market sukarela, and it's been around for about maybe 10 to 15 years, and credit from this voluntary market can be purchased now to use to offset your carbon footprint voluntarily. So for example, if you live in a country where there are no regulations that allow you punish you for a big footprint, but you want to reduce your footprint, maybe you want to increase your marketability to consumers who want more greener products, you can also offset your footprint voluntarily. And we look at pasaran karbon sukarela, right? Jumlah kredit yang dijana dan dijual telah meningkat dari tahun 20 since 2010, with the increased commitment iklim daripada pihak swasta untuk mencapai target sifar bersih to reach the net zero target. There's been an increase in carbon credits since 2010. And so we look at projects globally, voluntary carbon projects globally. There are projects all around the world, mainly in China and America and some parts of Europe. There's a lot of carbon offset projects, but we do see an increase in the region, in Malaysia and Southeast Asia, to develop carbon offset project. So, what type of carbon offset project are there? We can see from this chart, okay, so the highest volume in 2019, I think this chart is, that was sold is from REDD plus or forestry type project. So REDD means reduce emissions from deforestation and degradation. So mengurangkan pelepasan GHG daripada aktiviti menebang hutan or merosakkan hutan. These are the most popular type of carbon credits that are being generated and sold on the market. Right? This is followed by carbon credits from renewable energy project, wind or solar. So really, forestry and land use or carbon credits from forestry and land use projects are the most generated and the most sold. So there's a lot of standards in the market. So terdapat banyak standard di pasaran sukarela, tapi yang paling popular adalah standard VERA, Verified Carbon Standard, VCS ataupun VCS and CCB. So this is the most popular standards that's being used by various projects and also various companies who want to offset their footprint. So again, there are many standards, but I will only focus on the most popular one, which is VERA, Verified Carbon Standard, VCS. So VCS, I will use this term moving forward.
Doktor, saya mencelah sikit ya. Berkenaan dengan standard tadi, VERAS, kalau mengikut sekarang memang of course 70% untuk carbon project in the world memang guna VERAS standard. Tapi kalau kita membangunkan our own standard, dia akan dikira ke untuk offset Malaysia kalau standard tu tidak diperakui di peringkat antarabangsa? Terima kasih.
Yeah, I think there's two ways to approach this question. So one is market demand. Siapa yang akan beli carbon credit and what are their requirements? So if they're recognized, for example, a Malaysian standard, then no problem. They can use it to offset. Number two is multiple label. So in some of our discussion with other project developer, so for example, kalau kita, for example membangunkan project VERA di Malaysia tahun ni, for example, and we use VCS standard, and in the future there is a Malaysian standard, kita boleh guna dua label. So we can use two label for one project. As long as the outcome is real and measurable and is regulated, I think one project can have multiple labels. But to answer your question, memang I think it comes down to what is the market demand. So if you have a good standard and it's transparent and robust and companies can use it to offset, I don't see any reason why they will not purchase it. Is it okay? Okay. So now I will talk a bit more about what is the preference for buying carbon credit. Okay, so what do buyers look for? when they purchase carbon credit, line to offset their footprint. Okay, I think 35% of VCS purchase is linked to core benefit ataupun manfaat selain daripada mitigasi perubahan iklim ataupun pengurangan pelepasan GHG, like community benefits or biodiversity benefits. So companies, they don't just want to buy credit to offset. They also want to support projects that create other benefits for local communities, for wildlife protection. And when we speak to companies externally who buy these types of credits, why do you buy credits with more core benefits that maybe cost more? They want to support good projects that not just capture carbon. They want to share the story with their consumers, with their board members, with their staff or employees. Because carbon credit is not just GHG for footprint. It's also it's a green financing solution. We can raise funds not just to protect the forest, but to also manage it for conservation, to create jobs, to improve livelihoods. So there are a lot of other factors that are involved in buyer's decision when they purchase credit. I will briefly go over this. So if you want to set up a carbon offset project, you must meet the eligibility. Okay, there are 4 main criteria you have to meet. So dari segi teknikal, bagaimana projek boleh mencapai certification di bawah Verra VCS? Dia ada 4 syarat untuk memenuhi kelayakan. Number 1 is additional or penambahan. Projek mesti menunjukkan bahawa pengurang GHG tidak dapat dicapai tanpa projek tersebut ataupun tanpa hasil daripada penjualan kredit. So the climate benefit can only be achieved if we sell the credit. Okay. Number 2, real, measurable and conservative. Penggunaan GHG mesti dibukti, diukur dan dipantau. Okay, menggunakan metodologi yang telah disahkan oleh Verra. Number 3 is permanence. Penggunaan GHG mesti kekal sepanjang hayat projek ataupun jangka masa panjang. Alright, there must be strong evidence to ensure that the climate benefit is protected throughout the project period and beyond. And the last one is the project needs to be verified ataupun ditentusahkan oleh pihak auditor that is independent. So a third party auditor will need to come in and make sure that the climate benefits are real and measurable. It's the 4 important concepts that needs to be taken into account if we want to develop a carbon offset project. And under Verra, depends on the type of project. There are various methodology, very specific for different type of forests. So avoided deforestation, penebangan hutan yang dielakkan, either planned or unplanned, dirancang ataupun tak dirancang, penamaan semula, pemeliharaan, projek gambut, tanah banca, pengurusan kebakaran hutan, and many different methods projects can use to estimate how much carbon credit can be generated. But the important thing is, we won't go into detail today. The important concept to remember is all of this method follow the same concept. We have baseline, business as usual scenario versus project scenario. Okay, this is it. This is the underlying principle behind the methodology. So when we talk about developing carbon offset project, this is the life cycle ataupun kitar hidup project carbon offset. In the first stage is development phase, fasa pembangunan projek, di mana pengusaha projek menyediakan project document untuk ditentusahkan oleh pihak auditor. So this is to create the project design document PDD, which needs to be validated and verified. Okay. So the PDD disediakan untuk memberi justifikasi baseline scenario dan project scenario. Once the project is verified and validated, bila projek disahkan, kredit dikeluarkan oleh pihak Verra dan didaftarkan di bawah registry Verra. So the companies after that can buy and retire the credit, and the carbon credit is used to offset their footprint to reach their net zero target. So the credits will be retired or disara for those purposes. And when it is retired, this is also captured or dipantau oleh registry Verra. So the credits are generated maybe every year secara tahunan atau selang masa yang telah ditentukan, maybe every 2 years, every 5 years. And the credits dijanakan berdasarkan prestasi. So it's performance based. So after you achieve the outcomes, and then you can generate the credit. So these are the important concepts behind carbon offset projects. So we won't go into technical detail today. I want to leave that for next week. Sebab minggu ni kita nak introduce the concept of additionality, how to develop project, more on an overview lah on how these projects are developed. But next week we will go into more detail on how to develop project, how much credits can be generated, legal structure, for example. And that's before I end this section, I can share a video on a carbon offset project in Kalimantan, Indonesia, Rimba Raya project. It's one of the earlier projects developed under BCS, and it's also one of the largest carbon offset project in the world. So it's in Kalimantan. So I'll start the video now, yeah? And I will be stepping away for 1 minute for a toilet break. So I watched this video 10 times already, but I'll be back when the video ends. So please enjoy the video.
My name is Birute Mary Galdikas. I am the president and co-founder of OFI. Rimba Raya is very important to our work, and the reason it's important is because it will help us protect the forest. The forest east of the national park was given away as a palm oil concession, and that forest is absolutely magnificent habitat, not only for orangutans, but also for all the other wildlife, such as clouded leopards, Malayan sun bears, tarsiers. And what Rimba Raya did is nothing short of remarkable, because they clawed back that palm oil concession. And the fact that those trees are still standing is a tribute to the work of Rimba Raya.
Our mission is to try and create a new asset class around forestry. Ultimately, that was the goal of the UN and the Kyoto Accords, was to try and assign value to environmental services.
Everything that we do in Infinite Earth is about sustainability. So we don't want to do something that cannot continue beyond ourselves. We find there's a couple different types of customers. Some maybe have a very heavy carbon footprint and they feel it's necessary to offset that. But a lot of them feel a responsibility and they are convicted about it, whether it's the CEO or other people in the company, and they feel that it's their responsibility as a good corporate citizen to give back.
The way we measure carbon in a forest, we developed the world's first counting methodology for doing so, which was independently verified twice by UN-sanctioned auditors.
Verification is done at regular intervals by an outside independent third-party organization.
These standards are incredibly stringent. Rimba Raya has achieved several verifications and certifications. Number one, we were validated by CCB triple gold, which is the highest you can get, which means gold in community, climate, and biodiversity. We were verified and validated for VCS. They're the standard that issues the carbon credits. Rimba Raya is a forest in Borneo, which we're using the revenues from carbon credits to finance the protection of the area as well as developing the communities nearby. When the carbon credit revenues come in, we then allocate them to various programs. Some of them are environmental, some of them community related. The cook stoves is a great example where we're able to hand out these environmentally sensitive cook stoves. They use less wood, less smoke is released in the air. It's better for their health, better for the environment. Clean water is incredibly important in Rimba Raya. They live on a river. The river is not exactly clean, but they use that river for drinking water, washing, many things. And they do get sick occasionally. Through the revenues we receive, we purchase these filters, very simple clean water filters. And these filters enable them to take the river water, put it in the filter, and actually drink the water after it's filtered and realize the benefits, especially to their health.
The carbon credit plan has been extremely good, extremely fortunate for the forest. Most forests are now being converted to palm oil plantations, and particularly peat swamp forests. Without Rimba Raya being here, that forest would have been destroyed, demolished, burned, so that palm oil could come in.
If we're asking governments to not grant concessions that convert forests to palm oil concessions, then we have to provide an economically viable alternative. It can't just be a moral alternative.
We've got to come up with better economic models that don't borrow from their futures to subsidize our consumption today.
Yep. So yeah, this is an example of a BCS project. One of the most famous ones is the Rimba Raya project in Kalimantan, Indonesia. So carbon credit yang dijanakan oleh projek ini digunakan untuk aktiviti konservasi orangutan, community programs, forest protection, pengurusan hutan gambut secara lestari dan mampan. And the baseline scenario for this was all palm, and then the project scenario was diuruskan for protection. And then again, the carbon credit is used to support all these activities, aktiviti konservasi, community program, pengurusan hutan. Yep, so this is really one of the very successful projects. A lot of projects look at Rimba Raya as an example to follow. And that's my overview for carbon offset. The next one I will talk about is conservation liabilities or offset for deforestation. This is tanggungjawab pemeliharaan disebabkan tidak mematuhi atau memenuhi kriteria RSPO dan NDPE. And this is linked to the rantaian bekalan komoditi sawit. So when we talk about oil palm, like in the previous video, okay, very controversial, very, how do we balance production and protection? And I think in the last few years, we see a lot of pressure from consumers, around the world, because a lot of deforestation or emissions from deforestation are embodied in the global trade of commodities. So there's an increase in consumer pressure for product that is free of deforestation or degradation, and there's an increasing demand for sustainable commodities. So what are some of the response from industry, on how to make more sustainable production of oil palm? Right? There are many ways, there are very strict guidelines, Malaysia's RSPO and MSPO as well, that growers need to follow to ensure they are compliant with regulation and the impact is mitigated. And one of these initiatives under certification is for RSPO and NDPE is we call it conservation liability. So I will not go into great detail, but in summary, if growers do a land use analysis, and then when they apply for certification, the auditors see that, you deforested this high conservation value area. So for example, wildlife area or community use area or kawasan taraan air. In order to keep your certification or in order to be a part of the supply chain, you need to you need to commit funding into forest conservation. All right. So there's 3 types of remediation plan. There's social remediation. So for example, if you remove forest that communities use, you need to restore it, substitute and compensate. If you didn't set catchment or riparian zone, you need to have an environmental remediation plan. So this is within your ladang itself, within your plantation. And if you deforest important forests that you're not supposed to, you will have a conservation liability. So you need to develop a recovery project equal to the liability size. Okay, so if you see in the middle chart, how do they determine it? So if it's a complex forest or a simplified or degraded forest, there's a multiplier for it. And then based on when you clear it, since 2014 onwards, it's twice the area, but before that, it's the same size or half the area or not applicable. So 2005 onwards. So this is how they determine how these growers or supply chains need to channel funding to support a recovery plan project. Conceptually, the important thing I want to share from this slide is they follow the same 4 concepts as BCS project. They must be additional, long-lasting, equitable, and knowledge-based. So there are a lot of different types of examples how the oil palm recovery plan project or conservation liability is the same as a BCS project. but their focus is not on GHG, it's more on hectareage. But the projects are essentially, I will say, in principle, follow the same logic. So there are different types of project. Offsite protection, avoided deforestation is of course more favorable compared to offsite restoration, compared to species specific. So if it's not focused on protecting forests, it's focused on species. And last one is on-site habitat reestablishment. So clearing old palm to recreate forest. This is the most expensive, and it only should be used for specific cases. In all cases, they will always recommend offsite protection. So if companies have a liability, they need to channel funds for a minimum of 25 years to a forest conservation project, ideally in the same jurisdiction, but or in the same country or elsewhere as well, depending on if there are good projects that meet the requirements. So there are a few examples. When we share the slides, you can explore these examples. So this is from RSPO. So 25 years of funding is committed to these projects around mainly Indonesia again, but also in Ecuador and South America. Hutan Desa or Village Forest, Hutan Harapan, Katingan Mentaya, and the Sustainable Commodities Compensation Mechanism, SCCM. In the interest of time, I will not explain the projects, but I'll go over it briefly. So, in Kalimantan, there are a lot of community-based projects, restoration projects, orangutan projects, protecting the lands of indigenous Dayak territory, rehabilitation project for orangutan habitat. So there are a lot of projects that are already being funded through this mechanism in Indonesia. And in our discussions with potential, with the private sector in the commodity section, they are also looking for projects in Malaysia to fund. If the projects meet the requirement, they would be willing to commit up to 25 years of full funding to protect and manage the area. One of the first few projects is from Kalimantan again, Nangga Laut Village Forest. So Cargill committed 25 years of funding in 1,450 hectares of village forest. So these are community managed forests in Indonesia under the Plan Vivo certification process. And it's really for forest conservation. So forest management, forest patrol, restoration, firefighting, non-timber forest product production. So there is existing example of the private sector channeling funds into forest protection. And the important question is, how can we replicate these types of projects in Malaysia? So in Indonesia, they have forest license that are specific for conservation. So ecosystem restoration concession, REDD+ project concession, and community forest initiatives. So these are concession or licenses awarded by the government, provincial government or state government equivalent in Indonesia to manage areas for the specific purposes of conservation and protection. On top of that, the projects also undergo certification, BCS, CCB, and Plan Vivo. So there's the license awarded by the government for managing of these areas for protection. And there's also certification to ensure that the outcomes of the project is verified and measurable so that buyers are more confident to support this type of projects. And now I'll briefly go over REDD+ just to see where is similarity or parallel with what is going on in Malaysia. I will not go into detail because from our understanding, a lot of the REDD+ finance framework is still being developed. So I'm sharing slides that was shared by KETSA this year during the stakeholder consultation. So Malaysia or REDD+ finance framework ataupun RFF is a rangkai kerja untuk secure carbon financing for managing forests for protection. Okay, so they want to ensure there is consistency between policy, data policy at the national and the state level. They want to develop a finance mechanism, and their target is to reduce between 15 and 23 million tons of CO2 per year. And how do they want to do it? Okay, so the RFF, there are two main components. Forest Conservation Certificate and Forest Carbon Offset. So the Forest Conservation Certificate is for national and international market, whereby the Forest Carbon Offset is targeted at domestic market. So again, this is still being developed, WIP, so we should wait for updates from KETSA and federal government on what this will look like. But just to compare to my examples earlier on, so for example, if you want to develop a project targeted at the commodities sector, for recovery plan, we can use the FCC certificate to certify the project. If you want to develop carbon offset project, we can use the Forest Carbon Offset, FCO, maybe alongside Vera as well. We'll need to wait for the guidelines from the national government, but the important message here is there is a Rangkai Kerja being developed that would allow for the flow of funding from the private sector into forest management. Jadi, it will be in the best interests of landowners, state governments to start thinking about how to develop projects that are good, that can generate credits or outcomes that the private sector would want to channel funding into. Because at the end of the day, the private sector will want to channel funding into good projects. So what are good projects? We need to think about that. And what are the requirements? So it'll be good to, at this stage, think about how we can look at our forests differently now. It's possible in the near future to generate income, menjadikan dana from standing forests, from forest protection. And in terms of guidelines, they released the guidelines. This is what it could look like. All right. So at the national level, we have the UNFCCC commitment. At the national level, we have CASA and KETSA who will manage the carbon registry that's being developed. So they are here to make sure there is no double accounting. So if a project creates carbon credit, if you create one, you can only sell it to one person. You cannot sell it to 2 person, then 2 people offset. That's a double counting. At the state level, they need to provide project info, policy guidance, and annual reporting of units. The project will need to be consistent with a national GHG inventory or consistent with the standard that is being used. And very importantly, at the project level, the activities need to be additional, permanent, create positive impacts in line with the standards guidelines. So this is how we can connect the dot from a global level, national, state, project to activity. This is how we, at the project level, can contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation. Again, this is based on the guidance for BCM provided, still work in progress, but it's very exciting to see that the framework Rangkai Kerja untuk membangunkan dana from pihak swasta kepada projek-projek pemulihan dan pelindungan hutan is being developed. So we need to, I think, like I keep saying, we keep planning ahead. How can we look at our forest differently now? So these are the 3 main topics I want to cover today, pembangunan hijau, nature-based solutions, and funding from pihak swasta. Again, to provide a high-level introduction to the important concept and why. Why do we need to get familiar with this concept? Because next week, in the final webinar, just a trailer preview, we will be looking at these 3 things, which are very complex, more technical, project eligibility, how to make sure the projects meet the standard requirement, what is the structure, legal framework, project outcomes, how to measure the GHG, the impact on communities and biod, and the most important one is project economics, cost to restore and protect, opportunity costs, and also the cost to develop these types of projects. So we will be using Terengganu as the case study next week. But I think before next week, if anybody have any specific questions about these 3 things, you can share with us or with the moderator, and we can try to include it in our presentation next week. So if there's any areas in Terengganu that you feel can be explored, do share a list, and then maybe we can try to include it in our webinar next week. And with that, I will end my webinar talk today. So thank you for your patience.